Let's go now. A little life out here. What the hell's going on out here? Hey, what about that now?
Hello everybody, welcome to the UK Packers podcast. As usual, I'm your host, that's DDD NFL on Twitter, and of course follow the group at UK Packers. And look, kind of like a mock draft, a 53-man roster prediction is just a silly thing to do. So anyway, here's the 53-man roster prediction podcast. Look, it's a dreadful, dreadful time of year. You know, an awful lot of these young lads, the old young lads, their dreams are going to die on the hill here. Some of these players will get cut and never be signed again, and they'll have to get out and work regular jobs, whereas others will make it. But when I look down through the roster, and this happens every year, it always seems a bit obvious. And it isn't, because none of these, no one can ever predict it correct. Because there's going to be some weird ones. It's a bit more cut and dry than prior years, dare I say. There's no one on this sort of roster that I go, oh, I don't know if he's going to make it or not. There's maybe one or two I can see reason to, not carry 3 tight ends, for instance, and add an extra running back, because we don't know what's going to happen with Josh Jacobs. There's more rumblings lately that Josh Jacobs might face suspension. I don't know where it's coming from. I don't know why it's picking up moss. Up to now, it seems that the Packers have been convinced to, business as usual, get him in there, not stand by him, but there's an awful lot of stuff that needs to go on in the legal proceedings. But again, there's no smoke without fire, in the sense of, not saying that he's guilty of anything, but in the sense of there looks to be potentially a suspension there. So much so that they're asking Gutekunst and LaFleur, what do you do? And so Gutekunst turned around and was sort of saying, well, look, we're going to be prepared. Do you know, it's not in any way similar in the kind of legal ramifications thing, but it reminds me of the long snapper situation between Cal and Matt, and Matt's injured, so Cal's in there and doing a great job. Although we're seeing that Trace Mack is hot and cold and all that. But look, I don't want to get caught up in the weeds of it. Let's do it. This might be a short podcast. My logic for all of this was, who's been making names for themselves in camp? What is the injury situation at the position? And quite frankly put, you can nearly fill out the majority of the roster if you go and say who's the starter and who's the single backup in most positions. Now, of course, you'll have certain positions that you need extra depth at, but by and large, just doing that alone will get us, 75% of the way there. And I'm not going to draw it out. I'm not going to go quarterback. Well, let's dig into number 3. Look, there's going to be 2 quarterbacks. We simply don't have the luxury of being able to keep a third because we need it at other positions. So let's not waffle around the nonsense. So quarterback, Jordan Love. And like I said, starter, Jordan Love, backup, Tyrod Taylor. Tyrod, in that first preseason game, I thought he looked a bit skittish. He came out against the Broncos and did much better. There's no question marks there. They bring in a veteran for that exact job. They lost Malik Willis, so they're going to bring him in. Running back, Josh Jacobs for now. Marshawn Lloyd and Chris Brooks. And that's a position that you could go starter, backup, and is there anybody else? But typically you're going to keep your 3 or 4 running backs, depending. Marshawn Lloyd. So Josh Jacobs could be suspended, potentially, pending whatever is happening. Marshawn Lloyd is the definition of injury prone, and I know, that's taboo to say out loud and all this kind of stuff, right? But it's simply true. He's got a really bad run of it, but he's looking sensational in training camp and in preseason for what it's worth. But you really don't know, and it just goes to show you how absolutely decimated we are at some of these positions. Running back and tight end being the main ones. So Chris Brooks is in there, but Chris Brooks isn't in as a relief to Marshawn Lloyd or Josh Jacobs as such. He's a good blocking running back, so he might be out there in 2 running back sets. Wide receiver, again, Christian Watson, wide receiver number 1, Matthew Golden, Jaden Reed, wide receiver number 2 and 3 in whatever order you want. And then they're going to keep Savion Williams and Bo Melton. They've made a strong showing. And then Sky Moore is in there as the returner. So they carry 6 wide receivers, in my opinion. Again, not massively controversial. I don't think there's other people on the bubble. Now, they did ask Brian Gutekunst, would you keep a 7th? And he did say, so we have done that sometimes. But, it's like when you ask someone, do you want to head out one night? And they go, yeah. If it's not an instant yes, the answer is no. So I think that's what that is. So just like running back and what's going on there, we're dangerously thin at tight end. So Tucker Kraft is the obvious one. He partook in 11-on-11 drills, or was supposed to anyway. I haven't looked deeply into it. Josh Wiley, again, is a guy who's just constantly hanging around. And Drake Dabney has been hanging around as well. Now, I would understand if they carried 2 tight ends in the initial 53 and then did some moving and shaking, potentially. But for now, that's how I see it. And again, Tucker Kraft, we've the best of intentions for him. He's going to get that big contract. He's looking great from recovery. But again, there's that big giant sort of question mark and you want to wrap him up in bubble wrap. But I think we carry 3. If not, we carry 2. And I don't think that's to add a 7th wide receiver at all. I think Gutekunst sees that we're sorted there. Offensive line, and I see news articles saying we have the weakest offensive line in the league. Not that I subscribe to that, but I understand there's people at unproven positions. But this is another one that works out really well when you look at the Packers depth chart. You can go onto Packers.com and look at it there too. So Jordan Morgan at left tackle, Aaron Banks at left guard, Sean Ryan at centre, Z-back at right tackle, which is Zach Bakabuele, formerly Zach Tom. And then Anthony Belton at right guard. So obviously you need backup for each one of those positions, ideally. And the Packers typically carry 10 to 11 offensive linemen. So the backup Jordan Morgan, we've John Williams. To back up Aaron Banks, we've Jacob Monk. To back up Sean Ryan, we've Jacob Burton. To back up Z-back, we have Darian Kennard, who's carrying an injury, but they paid to bring him back, and I see sort of predictions out there that could have ramifications. I really don't think so. Anthony Belton at right guard, Donovan Jennings backs him up. So that's, 1 O-lineman and 1 backup. Defensive tackles, this is the only one, and I wouldn't even call it controversial because, it's one of those things. It's like Jay Kumaro all that time ago, Aaron Rodgers' favourite wide receiver, obviously. Just ahead of Jordy Nelson. When you look at lads who've made impact, but they're not really well known. Sometimes they have a cool name or a cool reputation, and a lot is made out of it. And that guy for me is Nazir Stackhouse. I think he did a great job last year, and I think he made a great showing when he was asked to. But I think he's been beaten out by Jonathan Ford when they brought him back, because in Jonathan Gannon's scheme, you need a big dude in the centre up front. But anyway, I think defensive tackles, Devontae Wyatt and Carl Brooks are the 2 starters, along with Javon Hargrave as well. That's why I brought him in. Behind them, Warren Brinson, Chris McClellan, and Jonathan Ford, and Nazir Stackhouse hopefully makes the practice squad. If not, he's signed by someone else. But again, that's one of those things where I could see them carrying 2 tight ends to get Nazir into the original 53 and then see where they go from there. But look, there's always something. There's always some mad arrangement that Gutekunst will drop someone entirely and sign someone off the street. So I wouldn't sort of rule that out either. Edge, again, the same sort of... And again, the added element to starter plus backup plus draft pick can work, and that's what we see with Edge here. So Lucas Van Ness and Baron Sorrell as the 2 starters. Danny Dennis Sutton is the draft pick, so he makes it in automatically. And again, he's a top draft pick, right? It's not going to go any other way. Then Brenton Cox Jr. and Colin Oliver come in after that, so that's 5 at edge. Again, nothing there massively controversial. Linebacker. This is one that, we're talking about one on the bubble player, but say your Franklin and Edgerrin Cooper are the obvious. Isaiah McDuffie and Tyron Hopper are the 2 very good backups. And then Nick Neiman is the guy who, they could carry 4 and swap someone out for Nick Neiman. I'm not sure. But to me, with the splashes that he's made in camp and all the stuff behind it, I think he makes it. So that's 5 at linebacker. Cornerback, safety, We can sort of mesh these together. There's some people I've seen that they've put Kamal Hadden as a cornerback. Some people have him at safety. But if you look on the Packers depth chart on their website, they have him at nickelback. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pop him in there. Cornerback. And again, this is a talking point. Keyshawn Nixon, does he make the squad? I really would be massively surprised if Anton went on there. I know some of the fan base, including myself, are not too enamoured by him on some of his play, but he is a starting cornerback in this league, of which there is not always starting cornerback caliber players. And again, I'm with you, right? He has these massive brain fart errors, these stupid penalties and all that kind of stuff, but he also comes up with good plays. But anyway, Keyshawn Nixon and Carrington Valentine coming into camp were the two defaults, right? And then you've Benjamin St-Juste, who we didn't really know what we had there, but we've seen him rotate in and out with the ones. Carrington Valentine carrying that injury. So Brandon Cissay's in there. But again, there's quotes coming out today about the, practice with the Cardinals and how it kind of apparently the Packers were dominated at the end of that practice. And Brandon Cissay is one of those players coming in saying, yeah, well, look, we need to do better. And my man, Domani Jackson, who I drafted personally, I put him down as making it just because he's a draft pick. He's not a shoe-in, but I think he's a player who could have a big upside. And look, there's question marks over him for sure. I mean, I wouldn't be massively surprised if he didn't make it. I really want him to. He had that core injury in camp, so he hasn't really got a fair shout. But I do think he's making his way back in, and they add him, and it's a position of need for the Packers. So I reckon that he does make it, and the fact that Gutekunst has only brought him in and he spent draft capital on him, I think he's got a good shot. But he's by no means a shoe-in. But I just think it makes sense to me. And again, Kamal Hadden, you can pop him in. I see some people have him at cornerback, some people have him at safety. But again, like I said, Javon Bullard and Kamal Hadden are the slot thumpers, right? So they're in at nickelback, and I think they both make the squad. So at safety then, which is incredibly important for Jonathan Gannon's scheme, is the two obvious, which is Xavier McKinney and Evan Williams. And who do they have as the third sort of rotational player? It would be Ketan Oladipo, who's seen as, his stock is definitely rising during camp, which means that at special teams, we've only 3 players left on the roster to make the 53, and it's obviously Trace Mack. And I say obviously, even though, again, there's reports coming out from camp today that he's only made 2 of 5 field goals, and one of them was manky. But again, he's one of those players like, was it Bobby Tonyan back in the day at tight end, who would have a mediocre training session, and then he'd go out and he'd be lights out on game day. So that seems to be what Trace Mack is doing. I mean, talk about putting the heart sideways in you. It's not exactly what you need from your special teams player, particularly the only one at that position. But look, as it stands, it would take a miracle, I would imagine, to not carry Trace Mack onto the 53. Now, there has been stuff in the past. Brian Gutekunst has dropped punters and kickers and got brand new people in. That's not going to happen here. Same logic with the draft picks, right? They drafted the guy. They're sticking with him. He's shown he has a leg. He hit a 59-yarder, which is the second longest in Packers history against the Broncos. So I don't think he's going anywhere. Daniel Whelan, phenom punter, not only because he's Irish, and of course we're best mates. And then this is the only other one, was whether they go for Cal or Matt. So Matt Orchek is injured, but they brought Cal Adamonominitis in, and he's done a great job. We see Trace Mack coming out and saying Daniel and Cal have done a brilliant job, they're the best holder and snapper that he's ever seen. But bearing in mind that Trace Mack is a rookie, he has never played in the league before. Relax. But they have done a great job. But look, they brought Cal in simply because they needed that operation to continue going, and he's done, in credit to him, he's done absolutely everything the Packers expected of him to do. But I think again it would take a miracle not for Matt Orchek to make the roster, not unless the injury is so pervasive that he ends up on PUP or whatever. And in that case, they switched him. Now, interestingly, all of the 53-man roster predictions that I've bounced around and looked at, because I was going to gather for this podcast everybody's predictions and compare them and all, but everyone's predictions are so similar that it didn't really make sense. I mean, I think, did I look at one website that did compare them, and they said something like 51 of the 53 across like 5 different pundits all said the same players. So that's kind of a product of where we are, being fairly light at cornerback, light at tight end, light at running back, quarterback, you only take 2, Wide receivers absolutely locked up. Tight end were very light there. I think the only decision is whether you carry 2 or 3. And then eventually, if you only carry 2, you're probably going to add a third anyway. Because again, it makes sense, right? I mean, you have question marks over your offensive line. You want to add a tight end and you want to make sure Chris Brooks is in there to bolster that blocking for Jordan Love, because that's the failure point. That's the single point of failure where this is all going to come crashing down. Bad O-line. Kiss goodbye to any plans you have for downfield shots because you simply don't have the time to let them develop. And then you can't break open running lanes. So if Josh Jacobs can't make the field for whatever reason, the one singular reason, well then Marshawn Lloyd's out there. And, you know, we saw all of this when he scored his touchdown against the Broncos, which was great, but that was the first time he'd scored a touchdown in a game for 3 years, which would just go to show you. So, look, high hopes for the Packers team, but when you look at some of the positions, it's not looking good. So we really need to make a splash on defense, and I think we're all expecting big things from Jonathan Gannon, because I think that's what's, you know, particularly at the beginning of the season, while the offensive line settles down and, you know, we sort of plateau on whether there's going to be injuries or not, or who we have a running back. I think that's really important to start strong on defense, and it's been slightly hot and cold, to be honest, in this preseason. Now, again, you can't take much from preseason. It's effectively a practice, but again, it comes down to the depth. So look, what are we looking at in the third preseason game? Not a whole lot. The starters are not going to suit up. That's including defense. And I know it's going to be billed as these are the people on the bubble on the roster if they're going to make their name. I don't think this is a practice squad session. This is a session for those players that are coming out that are way down the depth chart with no real chance of making the 53-man roster or practice squad, to put stuff on tape so that other teams can pick them up once they're released as part of that deluge of players that are released. So look, do I think I've got it all right? Do you think I've got it all right for the 53-man roster? Absolutely not. And I think that that's a product of this, I keep saying new, just goes to show my age and how long I've been doing this analysis and stuff, is that it used to be that sort of gradual cut down and players would squeak and leak, and you'd sort of keep your eye out for players. But now that they do this massive purge all across the league, there's so many players that flood the market, is that undoubtedly, you know, there's a couple of those that the Packers will have their eye on. So again, I'm not going to predict the practice squad because it's so unpredictable, in the sense that I don't think the 53-man roster, as I've called it out, is going to be what it is come cut down. Then sometimes it is, and then sometimes it isn't. So they cut it down to it, and then all of a sudden they make transactions almost straight away. And then on the practice squad, you know, guys that they hope to smuggle onto the practice squad, like Nazir Stackhouse, unless he makes the 53, often get poached by someone else, and the Packers similarly do the same. They get a practice squad player and bring him over either onto the active roster or whatever. Look, there's some obvious ones. I mean, you know, Micah Parsons is going to end up on, you know, in the nurses' quarters along with Luke Musgrave, whatever's happened in that situation, which again leaves us sort of open. And then, of course, when those, particularly Micah Parsons, when he comes back in October, he's going to bump out one of those players that we see on the 53. But unfortunately, the way, you know, the NFL goes with being a heavily contacted sport, is that some of these attrition is going to come through injuries. So again, there's all these talking points of, you know, who will Micah Parsons replace when he comes back? Sometimes it's a no-brainer because the person has done some horrific injury and he's sitting on the bench anyway. But look, let's hope not. But there's a 53-man roster. Let me know what you think. You know, any of that controversial for you? Are you concerned about the depth in the depth chart? Who knows? But look, I'll hold myself honest on the next podcast when the 53-man roster is announced. That's probably going to be the next one, right? Where we look at who made the roster, what were the surprise cuts, and we can jump into it. Because again, weirdly, sometimes with the 53-man roster, the decisions to place people on IR and PUP and all this kind of jazz, sometimes are surprising because a guy's carrying an injury you don't know he is, and then all of a sudden it becomes so much more severe. But anyway, fun for predictions, heartbreaking for players that miss out. Let's reconvene in a couple of days, see how we did. But until then, see ya.